Then I guess, yeah,
So
I can just start
we
from
can
here.
just launch right in. Cool.
All right. So, hi everyone. Good to see you virtually. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but yeah, I'm dealing with a broken leg and on forced to keep at elevator orders for the next week, like I have been for the last 10 days. So I'm definitely tired of being on my back, and really wish I could have been there in person. But for those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Colin Murphy. I hold a bunch of titles around ITS these days. Most of them are related to alternative fuels in one way or another. So I'm co-director of the Energy Futures Research Program. I direct the new biofuel land use change research program, and I also co-direct the Low Carbon Fuel Policy Research Initiative, which is basically the sort of fancy, overly long-winded name for the fuels team here. I've been doing alternative fuel policy and research for a number of years. I also got my PhD here at ITS. I finished in 2013. Most of my PhD was life cycle analysis of advanced biofuel production systems. But I've always been very interested in policy. I spent a year in the California Council on Science and Technologies Science Policy Fellowship Program. Certainly happy to talk about that and the experiences I gained there. And then 4 years of doing climate policy advocacy, mainly in California, for a nonprofit called NextGen. And in addition to that, I also had a number of sort of experiences in kind of associated to the communications space. I competed and coached college speech and debate for a long time. And so spent many years kind of thinking about what makes an argument, what makes a persuasive statement or claim or a persuasive speech. And as I got into doing more policy work and policy engagement, I started using those tools to understand how we communicate and why some of the communication between scientists and policymakers sometimes goes wrong. And so from that, I developed this talk that I've given a few times now. Let me quickly get my screen sharing going. Oh, someone's gonna have to let me share screens. Even though I'm a panelist, I guess. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you can see the title slide? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, I've given sort of a version of this talk for many, many years, really since I was a grad student, and it's evolved over time. But a lot of it, oh, it still has the Policy Institute's logo on. I need to actually take that off. Um, and so it's evolved over time, but it really kind of synthesizes what I've learned over the past 10 going on 15 years now of being a scientist whose main focus is on engaging with the policy process and trying to improve how we do policy and how we reduce environmental harms and work in areas where there is a real strong scientific and technical element. And so I think a lot of this is going to be start from basics and then start drilling down to understand it. And I think a lot of it comes down to of the difference in perception between how scientists and non-scientists look at the world and look at problems, especially scientific problems. And so what I've observed is a lot of for a non-scientist or a non-expert, whenever they come across a scientific problem, they're like, okay, well, this is obviously a scientific problem. Let's bring in a scientist and they'll do some science and they'll give us an answer. And then the problem's solved, right? Nice, simple, easy. And then for those of us who have actually been through, and you all are going through a graduate program to become, sort of master's or PhD level certified scientists, we realize it's a lot more complex than that. That when somebody comes to us with a scientific problem, we'll often spend a lot of time digging into it, researching it, understanding it. We will improve our understanding. We'll often improve the ability of others to understand it. We'll help define the problem. But the world, especially the kinds of problems that come up in policy, are so complex. Even when there's obviously science involved, there's not kind of a simple answer at the end in most cases. And so a lot of what scientists end up struggling with is how do you rectify or how do you kind of align these two concepts of how scientists can engage in the policymaking process, and move away from the overly simplified, just call a scientist and they'll fix it idea, to something that acknowledges these are complex issues where we often don't have the answers, and have to work under uncertainty. And so I've kind of distilled it down to these sort of 5 bullet points right now, and we'll go through them one by one, or I'll kind of talk about what it means and where what I learned, and also where I learned it. So to start with, I think that one of the most important things that any communicator in any discipline can do is to know their audience. And this quotation, she's a playwright and sort of a kind of performance art theorist, really points out the fact that with any communication, someone is communicating and someone is receiving it. Someone is in the audience, and there's a lot of context the audience is always going to bring with them. And whether this is fiction or music or art, or whether it's science and technical content, you have to understand that the context the audience brings with them, and realize that there's going to be a relationship in which the audience has a role. And you have to take that into account. It's not just we're sort of vomiting information out into the ether, and hoping that it's going to lead to better policy at the end. And I learned this largely through being a performer. My weird hobby is I perform at the Renaissance Fair, the one that's been in Gilroy for the last, or near Gilroy for the last 20 years. That's me. I'm sort of in the left in the background, and the picture on the right, where I've been both a street performer and a stage actor there. And a lot of what I do there is improvisational, where I'm walking up to people and trying to engage in some sort of entertaining theatrical interaction with them. And that really made me start thinking about, how do I figure out what the person in front of me wants and is looking to get, and how do I build that relationship with them, knowing nothing about it going in? And so that I started, when I started thinking about getting into more places in my career where I was presenting to policy audiences and presenting to stakeholders, general public business people, a lot of the same lessons I found ended up being really useful there. And so the first thing is you have to understand, why do I want to have this relationship with them? Why do I want to engage with this person? And if I don't know why I'm communicating, it's going to be very difficult for me to do it effectively. So as a scientist, when we are talking with non-technical audiences, especially policy audience, we're often trying to do things like alert them about a problem that needs to be addressed through some sort of policy or other action that can be taken. We may have a specific outcome that we think the research suggests is going to be preferable to what's happening now, or what might be on the table. Sometimes we just want to go and educate policymakers and educate stakeholders so they can make better decisions in the future. Not that we have a specific outcome, but we want to give them tools to be more effective advocating on their own behalf. And sometimes we're just trying to like identify ourselves as an expert, locate ourselves in the network of other experts and stakeholders that are working on an issue, and lay groundwork for the future. And so when you decide that I want to present some of this work to a policy audience, or I'm being asked to, I think you have to really think about, what do I want them to get out of this engagement? What am I hoping the audience takes home from this communication interaction that's going to be? And so I think a really good way to do that is to think about, what's your key message. If you were going to give the elevator pitch version, or the Twitter/X version of this, where you condense it down to a single sentence, like, what are those key elements? Because that usually should point you towards what the most important message you have, and the main thing that you want the audience to take away is going to be. And so once you have identified what that key message is, it's really helpful to make sure that everything else you say and do is in service and support of that key message. The second thing that is obviously pretty important is, okay, if you know what you're hoping to get out of it, then who are you speaking with, and what are they bringing into the conversation with them? And it helps to understand, are they scientists or experts? And I sometimes use the term scientists and experts a little bit interchangeably in this talk, but science is one set of tools. It is one kind of common approach towards developing and gaining expertise, but there are other ways people can become expert in fields other than adopting a scientific approach. And someone who has expertise in a field and gained it through just experience and lived and worked experience is going to have a different perspective and a different relationship to it than if they had been a scientist and gained it through scientific exploration and reading in that way. You have to understand what field their expertise is in. Have they encountered the issue or what you're trying to talk to them about previously? Because if they do, then they're probably starting from some position or some opinion of it, and it's helpful to know that. Really important to know: do you have a vested interest in one side of the issue? Right? When I'm going and talking about alternative fuels policy, if I'm talking to a room full of biofuel or petroleum industry stakeholders, I'm going to be talking about it differently than if it's a room full of environmental advocates or legislators. And so you have to know sort of like, do they have a specific outcome that they want? And it helps to go and tailor your communication around that understanding. So, in a lot of cases, people will be looking for opportunities to either write off, and say everything you say is wrong because you're opposed to their vested interest, or they want to find a reason to say everything you say is right because you align with their vested interest. And it's really important to know these sort of critical pressure points. And then also, why did they choose to listen to you, right? Assuming that you're not like kidnapping people and forcing them to listen to your presentations. At some point they made a choice to listen to you. Oh, I did see the question on slides. Yes, the slides will be available afterward. Perfectly fine to circulate this. But anyway, at the point where the audience is actually stopping and giving you their attention and listening to you, why did they make that choice? What are they hoping to gain from this? Because I think that ends up being really important. Because audiences, and this is the same whether you're in sort of an entertainment or marketing space, or you're in a very technical space, people today are bombarded with messaging, and they're bombarded with information, and there are, everybody carries around a phone through which hundreds of multi-billion dollar companies are fighting to go and get your attention. So if they chose to give it to you, there's a reason why they chose to give it to you and to listen to your scientific communication. And understanding why they're doing that will help make sure that it's effective, and they're likely to benefit and take home some of what you're trying to convey to them. Um, so, when you start thinking about this, you have to ask yourself, well, why should they listen to me? And what is the outcome you're trying to get? And so, a lot of scientists, I think, make the mistake of coming in with the attitude of, well, I'm an expert on this, and so you should want to hear my expertise because it represents the sort of top few percent of understanding on this particular topic. And so the qualifications and being able to say I'm a scientist, and here's my PhD and here's the number of papers I've published, that's great, but that's not going to make the communication successful, especially if the audience doesn't really understand why they're listening to you. And so it's really important to make sure you can articulate why the work and why whatever you're talking to them about matters to someone who isn't inside your field, right? For people who are in science, we have made a choice to spend years of our life dedicated to studying one very small, part of the world. And so we have a different perspective, and the things that we think are important, we have good reasons, I like to think, for viewing them as important, but the general public probably doesn't, because they don't share our background. And so if at any point you have the audience, kind of like asks themselves internally, wait, why am I here listening to this person? Why am I talking to this person? You probably already lost their attention, and you're now facing an uphill battle to get it back. So you need to be very clear to them why they're listening to you and what they're going to gain out of doing this. And this is where using something like art or stories or metaphors to link your technical topic to their lived experience can be really helpful. One of the best science communicators I've ever seen is a guy named Tyrone Hayes. He studies reproductive endocrinology in amphibians at UC Berkeley. He studies a lot on how pesticides have interfered with the reproductive cycles of frogs by being endocrine disruptors, and how that could apply to humans and be a risk in humans. And one of the things he did at some of his talks is, so he's talking about frog populations, and he will start playing a recording, and it's just like water, just you hear like a stream flowing down over rocks, and just nice pleasant water. It sounds like it's a really nice sort of steam thing. And he's talking about aquatic animals or amphibians. It sort of makes sense. And then he starts reading this, and so a lot of the work he does is in and around Salinas, California. And so he'll start reading this letter from John Steinbeck, who, very famous author, he wrote like The Grapes of Wrath and The Pearl and Travels with Charlie. And he lived and worked near Salinas. And so there's this letter he wrote to a friend of his talking about how at certain times of year in Salinas, the noise of the frogs is deafening. It's like an avalanche of sound. It's enough to drive a person mad. And, this is a very good, famous author using the full leverage of the English language to describe how overwhelmingly noisy and how, sort of just intensely loud the sound of frogs are. And then he'll say, so this recording of this water was taken 2 miles away from where John Steinbeck wrote this letter at the same time of year that he's talking about. And again, what he's playing is just water running over rocks. There's no frogs. And so the immediate like contrast of, today there's no frogs in this area. And 100 years ago, there were so many that the sound of them could drive a person insane, right? That contrast makes it really clear that something is profoundly changed. And for most people, that it's profoundly wrong, right? It gives them a reason to care about this, even if on their own, they probably wouldn't care about, the way hormone signals work in frogs and how that percolates through groundwater systems. So this is a good way of connecting with the audience. And even if it's a topic where you don't necessarily have a direct connection to them, making it very clear at an emotional or narrative level that these problems matter. And so that's very important. And it's where art and showing some passion and making it relate to them is really helpful. So next, once you've kind of understood what you're trying to gain, what the audience wants to gain, and helped figure out the dynamics surrounding this interaction between you and your audience, now it's time to think about the language that you use to connect with them. And Ludwig Wittgenstein was a philosopher of language and really did a lot of seminal work in talking about how the language that we have really defines the way we can think about the world and the way we can think about everything that's around us. And so I think there are, and this is coming from the years working communications and coaching public speaking and debate. And there's a lot of different sort of models or frameworks to define what is a message or what is a communication. One of them is that a message contains information and interpretation, or sort of like what is the content, and then what is the meaning, the what and the so what. And so an example of this might be that, like, you can say, hey, there's a fire in the living room, which might mean, oh, cool, get some hot cocoa, come sit down, relax and it's cozy. Or, oh my God, there's a fire in the living room, right? Grab the cat and run, the house is on fire. The content between these two things is the same, right? The words are exactly the same, but the implication, the interpretation is very different. And that was conveyed with things like the vocal tone and the pitch and the way, or the color that I used in the text. And so it's important to be aware of both the information that you're trying to convey in your message, as well as the way that you're as well as the interpretation that you're providing with it. And what's really important to realize is that science is based on data, and scientists and experts are taught to interpret data, especially scientific experts. And one of the things that we will probably have heard multiple times by the time that we get through grad school, is people will say, listen, as a scientist, your job is to let the data speak for itself, right? Don't insert yourself. Don't over-interpret. When you think about the way scientific communications works, things like peer-reviewed journal articles or presentations at scientific or technical conferences, a lot of the basic idea is, if you are a scientist, you are trained how to look at data and interpret that data and arrive at an appropriate conclusion from it. And when you're communicating to other scientists, you assume that they have the same training, that if you simply lay out the data in the proper way, they will look at it, they will interpret it, and they will come to the same conclusion that you did, because it's all based on the same set of scientific principles. And so when scientists talking to scientists, that usually works pretty well. The problem is that when you're talking to policymakers, they're often not experts, right? If you, so I spent a year working in the legislature and several years doing legislative engagement. Most legislators are not scientists. The one I actually worked for my fellowship year, Bill Quirk, was a scientist, but he was the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of people in the legislature have no scientific or technical training. Most of their staffs have very little to no scientific or technical training. So they're not experts. They haven't spent years, being taught and then practicing how to look at data and assemble that data into an interpretation that they can use to arrive at a judgment. That means that when you are a scientist communicating scientific information to a non-scientist, you have to interpret. You have to do the thing that in many cases scientific teachers have told you not to do, which is to insert yourself, to interpret the data and not sort of put it out and let the audience do it themselves. And that means you have to trust your expertise. And that's difficult because all of us probably have had the imposter syndrome experience where we sort of are as we learn more about our field, we become more and more acutely aware of how little we know even about our field. And so it feels weird sometimes to be trusting your expertise and providing that, but realize at the point where you even get accepted into a graduate school program in any given topic, you know more about that topic than 99.9% of all people on the planet. So congratulations, at the point where you're even in this room, you are an expert in the fields you've chosen. And you have to start sort of trusting that even though it doesn't always feel like that. And so I think this is where we start, when we start looking at how academics often communicate with policymakers, we start seeing some of the problems, some of the reason why communication between academics and communicators or scientists and I'm sorry, academics and policymakers or scientists and policymakers starts to break down is that the within academic science you have a community of experts who primarily communicate with other experts, and there's a set of communications norms about how we do that, things that tend to align themselves with how we write and speak and present in peer-reviewed articles. And those are useful when you're talking to an audience of other experts, but they're not useful. They're often unhelpful when you're talking to somebody who's not an expert. So, the fact that you have cited something, if you're talking to an audience that doesn't, that A, doesn't know the literature, and so doesn't know what you're citing and why it would help, and also doesn't have the sort of experience, where you use citations to validate arguments or claims, just having a citation isn't going to work. It's not really going to mean very much to them. Another thing is overqualifying conclusions. Scientists will often spend a lot of time talking about the uncertainty in a problem. And it's because, that's what we've been focused on. So we've been wrestling with and trying to solve for months to years at the point where we are presenting results to anybody. And also because, we are taught to be very careful and not overstate our certainty. And so in scientific communication, we tend to caveat things heavily, or try to limit and not make sort of broad, judgments. That doesn't necessarily work with a non-technical audience. You have to go and make the judgments. I find myself using the phrase as a rule quite a bit because I think for a lot of people who don't have a scientific training, when you say as a rule, it implies that there may be some exceptions to that rule out there, but that something is generally true. Another thing scientists often find themselves doing is they spend a lot of time talking about the methodology they used. The methodology they used to arrive at a conclusion. Again, because as the scientists, we may have spent years living that methodology, producing the work, doing the analysis, and most non-technical audiences don't care about the methodology. As long as you can make a claim that you used a valid scientific methodology to arrive, that's really all they care about. I saw there was a question. I'll hold some of these questions till the end, and we'll come back to them at the end. But the question about sort of lobbyists are uh, uh, it's a really good question, and I do have an answer to that. So, come on, there we go. Another thing that scientists often do and sort of screw up is that we have a lot of experience looking at big complex chunks of data and isolating the important parts of it, right? Whether that could be a big data table or a set of regression analyses or a complex chart or graphic. But we have gained that by having spent a lot of time in courses, in research, in training and mentorship and fellowship programs, developing those skills, and those skills don't always exist. So, this graph is of a frequency distribution. I can't even remember what I pulled it from, where we can see there's, two different frequency distributions. They have different shapes, and there's a lot of kind of interesting, sort of detail and interesting conclusions you can draw out of this. But for a non-technical audience, you probably have to distill it down to something as simple as blue is usually larger than green, probably most of the time, but not always, right? And yes, that leaves out a lot of detail. And anybody who has spent a lot of time doing statistics or in statistics course is going to be cringing at the idea of reducing it to something that's that simple. But if you don't reduce something that's that simple, often a non-expert audience is just not going to get it and not going to understand, or they will try to work through it but they'll get caught on some detail that isn't the main message, and then they won't be taking home the primary thing that you felt was important for them to take home from your communication. So you really have to think about that and sort of change the way that you communicate in order to be effective. The next thing that I learned is that it's really important to address the problems that policymakers and communities think they have, not really the solutions that you think would help solve their problems or what you think would improve their lives the best. And this is often a challenge because a lot of people, myself included, sort of came into science, gravitated to science because we like the way it can be a tool to make positive change in the world. So it feels, kind of strange sometimes to say, well, here I have this thing that I know will help, you or this person or community or jurisdiction or government, but instead you're going to focus on something else. But this is just the way you have to work if you want to be effective working in the policy process. And so, one of the most important things to realize is that policy decisions, when they're made, being scientifically accurate is important. It's one of the things that goes into determining what policy decisions are made, but it is not the only thing, and it probably shouldn't be. There's a lot of values and sort of subjectively determined desires that go into how people make decisions about who to vote for, what policies to support. And so it's really important that as you start engaging in policy topics, you understand the underlying non-scientific criteria and the values that are there. So this means that when you start engaging on an issue, it's important to listen carefully and authentically, and to be humble and make sure that you don't go in and reinforce stereotypes of scientists as being condescending or anything like that. It's important to recognize there's going to be cultural differences and a lot of diverse backgrounds in the policy space, who will have very different worldviews and very different sets of values to yourself. It's also important to realize that even though science is, I think, sort of the best set of rules or the best set of practice we have for ascertaining objective truth, science is never going to be perfectly objective, and it's never going to be a truly value neutral activity, right? You can never 100% separate the underlying assumptions and motivations of the scientist from whatever science they produce. And so unless you're in things like theoretical mathematics where you can actually prove things true in an abstract sense, there's always going to be some values embedded in any scientific decision, and it's important that you recognize that, and be aware of them, including of your own values and biases that might be embedded in your science, and as well as the fact that values are going to drive a lot of the messages that you hear from other people in the community. And one of the things that I've observed, especially when I'm trying to engage with disadvantaged communities, communities that have had an environmental justice, history where there's been environmental racism that's caused problems. A lot of communities who work in the sustainability, or not work, but who are seeking redress from the government to improve the sustainability challenges that have affected them, they have often had scientists come to them, for generations, saying, "Oh, this product will let us fix all your problems. So just let us go and build this factory in your community and it'll all be great." Or, this thing that we're trying to sell you will fix all your problems, right? They've heard scientific solutions offered to them many times in the past. And so they have an innate skepticism. And that skepticism is, reasonable and valid given their history. Even if it interferes with the ability, for you to talk to them about what you want to talk to them about right now. But you have to sort of start from their worldview and realize, the audience doesn't owe you their attention. You have to convince them that they should be giving you their attention. And so it really takes a lot of time to connect with people on a personal level in order to make them receptive to hearing a scientific message sometimes. And the last thing I would say is, in my career, in the times when I have screwed up communication, and there have definitely been some times when I've screwed up communication, it almost always comes down to I assumed that I understood a person's motivations, and I assumed I understood why a person was saying or doing something, and was wrong about that. And so I think it's a very easy mistake to make, and I think this is why it's very important to be sure to ask a lot of questions, spend a lot of time listening when you're engaging with non-scientists, with the policymakers or the general audience, to understand, and make sure that you're not providing responses based on assumptions about what they're looking for and hoping to get out of it. So as an example of this, and how values impact sort of policymaking, I've worked mainly on climate change related issues in my career. I think climate change is probably one of the greatest public policy challenges of our generation, though who knows, maybe the rise of fascism in the US is could eclipse that. I hope that's not going to be the case. But assuming that climate change is one of the public policy challenges, it is almost never one of the top considerations of elected officials. And this has been true for most of the last 20 years. That even the importance of climate change as something that could cause a lot of human suffering has that understanding has not changed. But officials usually don't view it as something. If they're on the left side of the political spectrum, they say it's important for us to do stuff about climate, but usually it's not in like their top 3 or 5 issues. And so there's this kind of disconnect between, well, the science says we should be a lot more worried about climate change than the policymakers actually are. And as difficult as it is to believe as someone who's, really kind of a scientist at heart, I don't think that their decision that climate change isn't a top consideration indicates that they're being, irrational or irresponsible on their part. Because in a lot of cases, policymakers, they are elected to represent the views of their constituents, and their constituents might not see climate change as the most important thing facing them. Perhaps they should. That's a open question we could debate in another form, but they don't. And so, to the extent that policymakers are fulfilling their role as elected representatives, their communities might not, and so they're probably representing that view as well. And so, even if you do think that a politician is being irrational or irresponsible by not caring more about climate change, and I think many politicians are, it is almost never an effective communication strategy to just say, hey, you're being irrational, irresponsible. Even if that's true, that's usually not going to be a message that convinces people to change their behavior. And if we want to achieve an outcome that protects, the population at large, we've got to work through the policymakers and get them to change their behavior, specifically what they vote, what they support. And so just saying you're being irrational, irresponsible is not a good way to motivate people to change their votes. So one of the things that I did to try to address this issue when I was doing advocacy for next gen, and this is in kind of the 14, 15, 16 period when California was working on bills like SB 32, which extended our climate authority beyond 2020, basically like kept us doing climate policy through the 2020s. AB 398, which extended the cap and trade program. It's now called the cap and invest program. But in this period in kind of the mid to late 2010s, California was pretty early on its journey in climate change policy. We adopted a bunch of programs to start reducing emissions and deploy technology, but they were all small pilot projects done by a wide variety of different agencies, and they were not very well tracked. Now the state has a map that sort of says here's all the projects we did to reduce emissions. That didn't exist back then, so we actually did an early version of that. So we combed through all the state databases to find all of the state projects for solar rooftop installation, household energy efficiency rebates, EV rebates, EV charger installation, pilot projects for zero emission or alternative fueled vehicles, pilot projects for advanced energy technologies, everything that was done in part because the state wanted to reduce emissions. We found all of these from various dusty, not for terribly transparent state databases, put it on one map, and then overlaid the congressional districts on them. So this is a map for State Senate District 5, which is around Stockton. So we could walk into, at the time, Senator Kathleen Galgiani's office, hand her this map that is of her district, is very familiar, layouts and geography, and say, listen, because the state cares about this, here's all the stuff that deployed into your district. And your district got tens of millions of dollars of investment in this stuff, which means there's projects on the ground, there's jobs from building all of this stuff. It got hundreds to thousands of rooftop solar rebates. So it's people who are paying less on their energy bills because they now have solar power. And because you could walk in and give something that very viscerally relates the problem to that person's home geography and breaks it down to here's the final number of millions of dollars of investment that went into your district that created jobs that went to make your people's lives better, that motivated their votes, not the fact that climate change is a crisis and is going to be a lot worse from us if we don't do something. It's, we got $20 million of vehicle and fuel incentives, and we got maybe the was like another $1 million of heavy duty truck incentives. Like that actually motivated votes to change because they viewed their problems more along the lines of how do I, ensure my constituents have jobs and can afford to live in California today, and not so much about the long-term threat of climate change. And so this was, reframing the climate change problem in terms of how they articulated their primary problems, not how we articulated them. And this ended up being a lot more effective than saying, no, you really need to think about climate change more seriously. So the next thing sort of message I distilled out of all this experience is what I call teach gently, and that is basically to say that like we at the point where we're coming in and talking about a scientific and technical area, we are almost always going to be, teaching whoever we're talking to in some small way, because we're talking about things that they didn't already know, and now they will. And not everybody wants to be taught in the same way. Not everybody is as receptive. Some people think they know everything they need to, or everything that's important. Some people don't. And so it's important to sort of view this opportunity to improve skills, but to be very mindful and intentional in how you do it. So some of the obvious stuff kind of aligns with language, but minimize any language that would make somebody feel sort of excluded or disconnected from your message. Like, so jargon's the obvious one. Scientific or technical terms, be careful about using them. I actually think it's okay to use a little bit of jargon or a little bit of terms of art as long as you define them. And by define them, I mean define them like right when you use them for the first time. Don't just put them on a glossary slide that you show for 5 seconds at the start and skip by, because I think sometimes teaching somebody this term that is useful to people who work in this field improves their mastery. They feel like they're gaining skills and they can better address these things in the future. And a bunch of behavioral research has said that improving mastery is something that is fundamentally motivating to a lot of people. So in a lot of cases, being very careful in teaching a little bit of jargon or a little bit of terms of art, not much, but one or two new concepts, I think can actually be useful. Beyond that, I think there are other terms that are not necessarily, jargon. They're not complex or obscure, but they are contextually defined. That is, they can mean different things to different people in different circumstances. And these are words like sustainable, right? What does it mean to be sustainable? What is sustainability? There are multiple, often competing definitions for that. What is significant, right? Does significant mean statistically significant or just big enough to matter? And how do we define that? When we talk about the system, where are the boundaries of the system? And so we might use these contextually defined terms in ways that we are very familiar with, or perhaps even experts in our field are very familiar with, but the audience might not be very familiar with them. And so you have to be careful to ensure that those contextually defined terms also get defined as if they were new, or as if they were terms of art to the audience that you're working with. Another thing that happens, and this is a bit of a digression, but it comes up because I've been asked this question many times, but like, how do you communicate with somebody who is just on a completely different plane of reality than you are, right? How do you go in and talk to a legislator who's a climate change denier, or somebody who's like a biblical literalist and who doesn't sort of, who thinks that science is mostly a distraction? And it can be difficult, but often these people will get elected, and they'll be important, and they will, by sort of necessity, be part of the process that has to get brought on board in order for good outcomes to happen as a result of this sort of science policy process. So, how do you actually start connecting with them and try to find the way to build enough of a connection that you can negotiate or have constructive discussions? And so I think the only thing that I've found that works, and the best piece of guidance I have, is you have to sort of understand and figure out what mindset, what set of like pre-existing beliefs about the world, assumptions, etc., do you have to hold before that person's viewpoint becomes reasonable, right? You have to go and start from a point where their opinions seem justified, um, and then move them off of that. And you can't start from your opinions are wrong, and you're basing this, your beliefs on fiction. Like that, again, that's just going to make them defensive. It's not a way to build constructive engagement. So it has to start from, okay, I can see how you would believe that, given that you have seen, X, Y, and Z. I could see how that would lead you to arrive at this belief or at this assumption. But when you start looking at these other things, and sort of gently start from where they are, and then move to kind of expand their horizons and consider other viewpoints. And it's not easy. It is time consuming. It's yeah, you're not going to get a lot of immediate satisfaction out of it. But minds do change, and the only way you get people to start breaking down, long held beliefs that are unscientific is to start listening and thinking about it and actually engaging it. And that works a lot better if they're not feeling attacked and defensive from the get go. The other thing that I think is important to remember is, sometimes, especially in the policy space, you're not going to get everyone on board, and there is going to be conflict, and there's and just somebody's not going to like the outcome of whatever process you're in. But it's important to recognize that certain uh, places in the policy space, certain forums and entities are better equipped to have and resolve conflicts than others, right? So legislative bodies like the California legislature or Congress or city councils, they're meant to resolve conflicts by voting. Courts are meant to resolve conflicts by sort of expert independent adjudication, using law and precedent as a guide. Those are places where there is a way to resolve conflict, and so it is and sometimes fine to just say, okay, I fundamentally disagree with you, and here's why my side is better and stronger, because you're in a venue that can resolve conflict. But places like regulatory agencies, social service providers, they often don't have a way to resolve conflict in the same way. So messages so there it's a lot more important to focus on trying to find areas of agreement, or at the very least, focus on what does the law say that this agency has to do, and pick your fights carefully. Don't try to pick a fight at a regulatory agency when they don't have the legal authority to do what you want them to do. That fight's not going to help. You're not going to make any sort of lasting change by doing that. So when we think about how you actually sort of teach effectively, assuming you're teaching people who have chosen to listen to you and want to engage with that. A lot of this you've probably heard before, but I think a good presentation, a good communication with a non-expert audience. One is it's got to be simple and very focused. You can have one or at most kind of two complex concepts or like key messages in there, but you have to really make sure that everything is focused on those core messages. It is really easy if you can have, we're always tempted to have these like interesting little digressions because we found this neat fact, and people do enjoy science when it's just neat and interesting. But you have to be careful that you don't give them an opportunity to just remember that and not everything else. Did I hear something from the room?
You heard loud motors outside.
Ah, okay, cool. All right, that's fine. Next is kind of like explain more ways than necessary. So, I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to teach or be a TA yet, or teach classes, but one of the things that as you start doing that, as you get deeper into grad school, you might have the opportunity, and you'll learn that not everybody learns the same way, right? And so most teachers who are really effective when they're bringing new concepts to the class, they teach it or they explain it in more than one way. They might, sort of do it through a very, regimented mathematical way first, and then use an analogy or use an approximation. There might be two or three ways to do it. And I think it's helpful to have those multiple ways of explaining something in your communication with policymakers, because they might not get the way you try to explain it first time. But realize that it's probably going to be more like teaching than just describing, explaining, or conveying, because there's a very good chance that whatever you're talking to them about might be new enough that they're on new ground, and you have to sort of view it more as a teaching opportunity than communication between somebody who already knows it. And that means you have to really ruthlessly edit your messages, edit your presentations, edit down to your 30-second presentation. Make sure that everything is focusing on the message that you want the audience to take away, and nothing is extraneous, because every little bit of extraneous detail could be the one thing that catches the audience's attention and that sticks in their head and that they take away, and that's not the primary thing that you wanted them to learn from it, not the reason why you chose to communication. The other thing is, in all these engagements with policymakers, we are not going to be able to convey the full depth of complexity of the topic, as we have come to understand it as scientists and experts. So we're always going to say, that there's a lot more, and we're happy to provide more detail or follow up with them. And it's really important that if the ask comes, that you follow up very, that you follow up and you actually do send them the information they requested, or provide them the follow up, and do it in a timely fashion, because the policy calendar moves quickly. If somebody from like the legislative side of things, committee consultant or legislative staffer reaches out to you because they have a question, chances are, if you wait a week to get back to them, it's already too late. The vote's already happened, and your opportunity to engage has now passed. So it's very important to follow through where possible, because if somebody's coming to you because they want information, that is a great sign. That is a sign that somehow you have either identified yourself or been identified as an expert, and they come to you receptive and wanting to hear what you have to say. So don't let those opportunities fall through the cracks. And so, kind of, I think this was the last one, is find the right moment and understand the right timing for how to provide these messages. And there's a couple different aspects to that. The first is, if you want to be effective at engaging with policy, it is really important to sustain your engagement. And one of the main ways I see scientists do science policy engagement very badly is they do a research project, they finish the research project, they go and they do a briefing on Capitol Hill. Like they find the right audience, and they'll present it to legislative stakeholders or to regulatory staff. But they do that presentation when the research project is done, not necessarily when there is a bill coming up, or when there's a rulemaking or some other regulatory activity happening on that topic. But they have this idea that, well, okay, so I've presented it, the people who I want to are aware of it, so in the future, when they do this, when there is a bill on this topic, or when there is a rule happening on this topic, they'll remember that they saw this, and they'll think back to what what I taught them here. And that is almost never the case. There is so much information in the policy space that anybody who you're going to be engaged with has to deal with, that they are probably not going to remember very much about the presentation that you gave 1 or 2 years ago. If you're lucky, they'll remember that somebody from UC Davis came and gave them a presentation, and they might be able to figure out who it was and get to your name from it. But they're not going to remember it. And again, this is, I think, a holdover from norms of scientific communication, where whenever we publish a peer-reviewed paper, it is expected that we will have done enough lit review, that we have seen all, or at least a most enough of the relevant material in this field, that we are aware of it, and that we're citing work that's already been done, and that we're not and that we're not forgetting something that's already been said about this topic. But that doesn't necessarily hold. That expectation is not ingrained in people in the policy space. So you have to go and make sure that you present their material when they are receptive to it, right? So if you did research on a certain type of different type of fare model for transit or alternative fuels, you want to make sure that you reach out and engage with the policymakers when there's a bill that's sort of in the pipeline and going to be coming up in the next year, or when there's a rulemaking planned on it, when the people in the policy space are thinking about that topic, not when you happen to be done with your research project. And so that means you often have to spend time tracking what is the policy space doing in order to know when to go and talk to people. And that tracking, it's time consuming, but there are some ways to do it, and I can give you some pointers on that if there's interest. Another thing to realize is when a scientist is thinking about a problem, and we just got a grant to investigate X and produce a report on something, we will start, and part of what we do is the lit review, where we will sit down and look at papers and read papers and do research. Certainly in the legislative space, which is where I have the most experience with my policy engagement, there is no time to sit down and do more than a very brief period of Googling, but nothing like a full and formal lit review. And so usually when legislative staff are trying to research something, they need to call somebody who understands it, who can explain it to them. And they do it by calls and emails. You're not going to be the person that they call or email unless you are in their network, unless they are aware of you, and you have seen them and talked to them enough that when they think about this topic, they associate your name or face with it. And so that's why you have to sustain your engagement. You have to talk to them more than once. You can't just provide the briefing once and then expect that 2 or 3 years later, when the topic actually comes up in a bill, they'll call you. You want to keep checking in, and you want to keep repeatedly identifying yourself as, I am the expert on whatever topic you're the expert on. And if you have questions, feel free to call me, and I can help you navigate this. Working through committees through professional associations, formerly TRB, that was often a place policymakers would go, or the different professional associations. Those are often worked. So it's another good way to sort of get into the policy spaces, join these committees or working groups. But also sometimes you just get lucky. So when I was a grad student at Davis, I was in the grad student association. I was the external affairs officer, which meant that I would go to Sacramento and to DC occasionally to lobby for things that were of interest to grad students, mostly research and grant programs and scholarship programs for grad students, research funding, visa issues for foreign graduate students. And so you'd always go in, you'd make your pitch, have the conversation. There'd usually be some small talk where they'd ask, "What are you studying?" They'd ask, and I tell them I'm studying biofuels. And on 2 or 3 different occasions, they'd go, "Oh, you're studying biofuels? That's great. There's this bill coming up, in the committee my boss sits on next week about biofuels. Can you please tell me, explain some of this stuff to me, right? What is ethanol, or what are cellulosics, or what is this term that's in the bill?" And so it was great because I happened to be there, so I could tell them and help that staffer become better prepared to do it. But realize that vote was going to happen whether or not a biofuel expert happened to wander into that office on a completely unrelated topic. So just simply being out there and regularly engaging with policymakers and talking to them, even if you don't necessarily have anything to talk about, but hearing what's going on will be a really good way of understanding what's happening and getting you connected into those networks and making it so you're more likely to be the person that is called or emailed when there's a question and when there's a need for expertise. And so the other reason why you have to really sustain your engagement is that often you can be successful, but not in the way that you really envisioned. And policymaking is almost always going to be a long-term process. Most bills never pass on their first time. It takes them a bunch of attempts. So when I was a science and technology policy fellow for CCST, working for Bill Quirk, literally the first things he said to me after hello were, "How can we help the low carbon fuel standard?" And so I thought, well, this is great. I came out of ITS. I worked on low carbon fuels. Dan Sperling, who co-created the LCFS, was one of my advisors. I am the perfect person to help, the state pass a bill to improve the low carbon fuel standard. So, as I started my fellowship, I started researching options of what bills could we do that would help, improve the functioning of the LCFS. And so of those options, we had to go through a couple iterations before we came to the right language and the right bill. It's kind of a long and somewhat funny story. I can tell some other time. But we ended up coming up with some language to sort of say we're going to create this subcategory for very low carbon fuels, or fuels that are more than 50% lower greenhouse gas over their life cycle than petroleum. Because the concern at the time, and even still to some extent, is that the LCFS was supporting too many fuels that are, 10 or 20% cleaner than petroleum, and not enough of the stuff that is actually going to be helpful over the long term. So we had a bill. We didn't think this bill was going to pass. It was sort of too big and too ambitious. And normally bills like this, we think most bills die in what's called the Appropriations Committee, where they kind of just, go into the committee and don't emerge, and they die quietly there. And that's what we thought was going to happen. But instead, the oil industry decided to make an example of us and flip a Democratic senator to vote against us and make an example of, here's what happens when environmentalists try to go and reduce the amount of oil we consume, and killed our bill in a committee that we thought we were going to get through pretty easily, which sucked. Also happened the day before my birthday that year, which really kind of rubbed salt in that particular room. So my bill was dead, and that wasn't great. So I ended up leaving the fellowship after my fellowship year was up, and a new fellow came into the same office, and he took the same basic idea that we did, but put it into a bill that only applied to the fuels that were bought by the state to supply state fleets. So a much smaller version of the idea got put into another bill, and that bill passed. So that now became a requirement for all the fuels the state uses in its fleet. And then a year later, CARB had been appropriated $40 million by the legislature to support very low carbon fuels, and they used the definitions and the basic framework we had created in our bill to guide this appropriation. So even though the bill that we started with got very publicly killed by the oil industry, the basic concepts sort of went continued on and went through and eventually got adopted into California law. And so this aligns with kind of a fairly common conceptual understanding of how policy evolves and works in the legislative space. My favorite, kind of policy book, the book that I was assigned during my master's public policy program, is a book called Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policies by a guy named John Kingdon. Last name is Kingdon. They put out a new version like 2 or 3 years ago that really sort of shows how policymaking is not rational in the way that we'd think, that legislators like see there's a problem and sit down with a clean sheet of paper to decide how are we going to solve this problem, but rather when there's a problem, they look around for a solution that's already been discussed, it's already in solution that people are already familiar with, and try to use that solution because it's already familiar rather than coming up with something from scratch. And so it can be useful to just start introducing solutions into the policy space, get them into the legislative discussion, and then they'll often percolate out and get adopted in unexpected ways. So and to sustain your engagement, this often means that scientists have to take on a bit of an advocacy role. And to some extent, I think this answers the question that someone answered earlier on kind of the effectiveness of lobbyists. So like businesses and governments, they make decisions that are fundamentally scientific every day, but they don't always understand the science behind their decisions. But businesses, especially, they do understand the effects on their bottom line, and they hire lobbyists to constantly do that. And so the question I think was like, why are lobbyists so effective at doing that? And I think one of the main reasons is the policy process has windows of opportunity where it is very receptive to outside input. So when a bill, goes through the legislature, it goes through multiple policy committees, which hold hearings on it and debate and amend and sort of dig into the details to do that. That's one of the places where the legislative process is receptive to outside input. When a regulatory agency does a rulemaking, they have to hold workshops, usually often multiple workshops. They are often required by law to not only take public comment, but also respond to every comment, to at least show that they have heard the argument or the claim or the grievance that everybody has submitted through these comments, and at least make some sort of response to say, we hear you, and either we're doing something about it, or this is not reasonable for us to do something. So lobbyists are effective because they show up to all of those opportunities. They take advantage of every single window of opportunity. They are always there for every hearing, showing up and making a comment. And at every opportunity, they are repeating their message that is good for their bottom line. And that's why they're so effective. It's not that they're lobbyists are people too. Some of them are really smart and really articulate. Some of them are not. They're effective because they are paid to reserve time to show up and participate in the process to the fullest extent. They are paid to spend time just doing visits and regularly checking in with regulatory staff, with legislative staff, and having these conversations and just identifying themselves as, whenever you're thinking about my industry, I want you to, I'm the person you're going to think about. So they're the person that staff call when they have a question about it. And so it's not that, they've got some special like lobbyist ninja advocacy training they go through. And yes, the ability for lobbyists to give campaign donations absolutely helps and absolutely increases the attention that elected officials pay to them. But that's not it. I think most of it is they show up, they are always there, and they are always repeating their message. And that means if scientists want to make sure the voice of science is heard in the policy process, you have to go and get the scientific message into the policy process as much as you can. And we are not paid to do that, right? Most of our research grants do not say, do this research and then go talk to the legislature about it, show up at legislative committee hearings about it, right? They say, do the research, publish the report, and then you're done. And that means scientists are often required to take it upon themselves to proactively engage with advocacy. And that is, time that we don't have. I'm sure everybody here feels overwhelmed and with way too much stuff to do, and that's not easy to do. So yeah. Oops. So, when we think about science policy engagement, when it goes well and when it's effective, um, it's the scientist or somebody associated with them follows the legislative committees and the regulatory agencies and engages early in the process. And this is absolutely critical. That I talked about these windows of opportunity. These windows of opportunity are not, like the hearing right before the final vote happens, right? They're not the week before the Senate passes the vote to send this bill to the governor's desk. They are months and months before that. And one of the main ways I see just not only scientists but advocacy groups in general go wrong is, most people aren't tracking this stuff, so they don't find out that the legislature is about to vote or an agency is about to vote until mainstream media starts reporting on it, and that's usually right before the final vote happens. And so then they show up right before the final vote and give an impassioned speech, and sometimes they bring up really good points that should have been considered and should have been thought about during this process. But at the point where you are right before the Senate casts its final vote, or right before the executive board of CARB takes their final vote to adopt a policy, that is the culmination of months to years of effort. And the windows of opportunity when the system is willing to listen to scientists are months beforehand. They are rulemaking workshops and pre-rulemaking workshops and legislative committee hearings, things that they are public. If you know where to look, you can find where these are advertised, but they're not super public. You have to know where to look and proactively go out and look for it. But they're willing to take feedback early in the process before they have circulated a draft, had it reviewed, had it get partway through the process. That's already kind of too late to do the engagement. So really, you've got to start tracking. And the moment a regulatory agency starts doing workshops, that's when you want to show up to the workshop, listen, and start giving comments. Another thing is, scientists often, they're getting better. I've seen this out of the scientific community over the last 5 or 10 years, but they're better at providing plain language summaries with links to the primary research material. So handing a legislative staffer a stack of peer-reviewed journal articles is often not helpful unless they happen to, have come through a science fellowship program like me. But for the rest of them, the stacked articles, it's not something that they're going to be able to interpret very effectively and figure out what they mean. Good science policy engagement is aware of existing law. Agencies can only do what the law tells them to do. And even if the law, tells them to do a stupid and unscientific thing, they have to do that because otherwise they're violating the law. And so you can't just walk in and say, hey, CARB or CEC, you should do X, Y, and Z, if the law tells them that that is explicitly not allowed or is outside their jurisdiction. So if you want to be good at doing science policy engagement, if it's legislative, and like you found out that there's a bill on a topic that you have expertise on, first thing you want to do is contact the author's office, whichever assembly member or senator introduced it. You want to get the name of the staff person who's managing that bill, get their contact info, and just say, hey, listen, I'm a researcher, I'm working on this stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to talk to me. And then you can decide if you want to proactively try to set up a meeting with them and talk more, or if you just want to go and identify yourself as a resource. In California, the committee consultants, so these are staffers who work for the committees, not for necessarily any single member. They're the ones who are usually going to take the most deep and analytical look at bills, the most kind of like scientifically aligned look at bills of anybody who's in the legislative process. They're probably going to be the most interested and most able to talk about scientific issues of anybody in the legislative process. And especially in California now, many of the committee consultants, and probably most of the committee consultants that are any committees that deal with things in the scientific area, are now former CCSD science fellows as those committee consultants. So now in California, there's a good chance if you talk to a committee consultant, they're going to have a PhD and they're going to be able to really hang with you as you get into the weeds of methodological detail if you want. It's good to engage with groups that are supporting or opposing a bill, and kind of lean on them to help navigate through the process and help figure out how you can be most effective as an expert in this space. And then it's important to submit comment letters. It's you want to submit a letter even if you have a conversation with somebody, because the letter is how it gets onto the public record. And ultimately the state has to go and show that if somebody brought up a legitimate concern and was on the public record, that they have considered it and taken appropriate steps. So putting it in writing and submitting it is important, not just having the conversations. For regulatory agencies, you want to, when the agency asks for information, they will put out requests for information quite a bit. Respond if you can, because that starts identifying yourself as a source of expertise and help for them. When an agency announces pre-rulemaking workshops, or that they're even just doing a request for information on something, that's when you want to start talking with the staff and understanding what they feel like the uncertainty is and what they're looking to gain out of it, and figure out where you can help. Then, go to the hearings. Even if the hearing is only part of it is on the stuff that's directly interesting to you, show up, listen to what the community is talking about. That'll help you understand how everybody else is feeling about this in the context. And then, make a comment if you want, or don't, but also submit a written comment after the workshop. And that, understand the agencies are going to have limited authority. They can't just freelance to do whatever's right. Bad science policy engagement, and I've seen plenty of this, where you just send peer-reviewed journal articles with minimal explanation. You engage right before the final vote or during periods when the staff are busy. So, like in the California legislature, if you want to go and talk to people, legislative staff, about here's a problem that you may not be aware of, but you should be, December, January are really the times of year when they're receptive to those messages, because this is the off season. This is when offices are thinking about what do we want to focus on next year. And this is when legislative staff can take some time to actually do a bit of research and learn about a bill topic they might be working on this year. During the year, when it's sort of in the committee season, then all they care about are the bills that are coming through their committees, what they need to know, and should they be recommending their boss vote yes or no. They don't want to have what's a new thing that should be on your radar during sort of committee season. Bad engagement is talking about sort of the ideal policies or how things work in the model, and not assuming away all the complexities of the real world. And that ends, we have to do that to get publishable results sometimes, but we need to not to accept all the real world challenges when we talk to policymakers. Meeting with policymakers only once is a problem. Assuming government can just find money to throw at a problem to solve your problem is bad. So, yeah, there's a lot of ways to do this poorly. The last thing, I'm going to skim through it because I think we've people have talked about it in other places, but one of the things we do here at ITS quite a bit is we write policy briefs. I think they are a great tool. I am surprised how in the legislature people still often want the physical piece of paper that has something. And so a policy brief where you distill everything that a policymaker needs to know about your topic down to a single page, front and back, 2 pages, where you have key research findings, where you have bullet and bold point of the key finding, 1 or 2 sentences of explanation, some simple graphs. I think they're fantastic. NCST does this, UCITS does this. I'm happy to talk about what makes a good policy brief, but I want to leave some time for discussion. So yeah, to improve, practicing is really important. Just speaking, even if you're speaking to a mirror or to your cat, there's muscle memory involved in speaking. So if you're going to give a presentation, you find yourself to be a nervous speaker, practice and develop the muscle memory for what you're going to be saying is important. And then also, if you can find a similar audience and test drive it, that's great. I think it's important, when you're speaking to a policy audience, focus on the conclusion, the key message, and then condensing and expanding. So, right, figure out what your 30-second version of your elevator pitch is going to be, and then make sure that everything in the long form supports that 30-second version of the elevator pitch, and it gets there. So that's it. I think there's one other question from Q&A. For listen to naysayers more than naysayers and articulate and move their concerns. Yeah, I mean, I do think the point of Tara that you bring up, that certain people are, more focused on sort of poking holes and in plans or on preserving the status quo. It's important to recognize when somebody is just inclined to have a certain type of approach or attitude to this, and to reflect that. So I'm happy to take questions. I can stay till after 3 if anybody is interested. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, and hopefully this has been helpful. But yeah, any questions? I'll also take stunned silence if that's where we are.
I'm curious about I think the pace of research and the impacts of policies tend to work slower than is kind of optimal for a lot of policymakers who want to see results
Oh
quickly.
yeah.
I'm curious about like how you would recommend sort of, I guess, advocating for a policymaker sticking with a project that you think will have good results, but they're down, basically when these are in conflict, how would you recommend
Yeah, that
presenting?
is really tough. And I have absolutely noticed over the last kind of 10 years or so that I've been in this space. Um, ITS really focuses on doing policy relevant research. And there has been among the funders, the people who support research, a lot more focus on coming to us with projects where here's a research project. I need you to have a report done in 6 months so I can take it to the legislature and use it to advocate for something immediately. Um, Even when we tell people, listen, like you're talking about an area where there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what the right outcome is. We need to do a research project that's going to take quite a while for us to get there. Um, and that's a challenge because we may say, hey, this is complex. There isn't a quick, simple answer. Somebody out there is going to say, oh, yeah, I've got a quick, simple answer here for you, right? Usually going to be a business who says, my product is the quick, simple answer you're looking for, or a consultant who, a lot of consultants that their job is to give the client what they want. And if the client wants an answer in 3 months, you give them an answer. It may not be a terribly insightful or useful answer, but you give them an answer in 3 months or 6 months. Um, so I think, to some extent, you often you may have to explain why we can't solve the problem now. So I mentioned one of the centers I direct is the Biofuel Land Use Change Center. And we've been talking in the alternative fuel space for years that the problem of what we call indirect land use change is really complex and we don't have good tools for it and we don't understand how to make better decisions, and it's adding a huge amount of uncertainty to all of our policies that may support biofuels. And we were clear from the start that best case scenario, it's going to take multiple years for us to develop something that is an improvement over the current state of affairs. And I actually spent some time, like in 2023, I gave this presentation to the EPA Center on Environmental Economics on, why is understanding the uncertainty in ILUC modeling and ILUC risk mitigation to help people understand why we can't just use an existing model and muddle through using the tools we have, why we need to make this investment. And it took a while, and I think it eventually got us there and had the impact, because I think that sort of contributed to us getting the funding to do this center. But I had to spend a lot of time and have a lot of presentations where I was really focusing on this uncertainty and explaining why we had to do research, and the research wasn't, and there was no 6 month answer on the table. And that may be what you have to do. I mentioned I have to sort of start from where the audience is, start from their understanding and beliefs that make their position make sense. And so it's possible that if you start from there, the first thing that has to change is you need to disabuse them of the notion that there could be a quick scientific answer to this, and that this is necessarily going to be a multi-year research project that's required. So that might be the first step of the communication you have to do. And then once you convince them that, all right, don't trust anybody who says they've got a quick fix. Now you can start having a conversation of what does an actual fix look like. But it's not easy, and it's something that I am hoping that we're going to see the pendulum swing back a little bit, and more funders start to recognize that it takes long-term research commitments to develop the tools and the answers to a lot of these questions, and that we need to have more funding that's aligned with this long-term, tool and capacity building, and not quite as much with a just take what we know and give me an answer, for the next legislative session.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, not hearing any, and we're basically at time anyway. I'll send the slides to Anna and Joanna to circulate to everybody in here. For any of you, as you keep working on the stuff in your programs, if you are you're curious about how to do engagement, if you have something where you think engagement's going to be on your radar, but you're not sure how to do it, there are a couple of resources. It used to be the Policy Institute was the logos that started my talk. That no longer exists. It's now sort of housed in the Policy Collaborative, which is here at ITS, and so you can come to the Policy Collaborative, and that will help connect you with tools and resources for engagement, or just come to me and ask questions. I'm happy to go and share experience, or kind of walk through planning what a successful engagement, a policy engagement campaign related to a research project might be, or if you see that there's a rulemaking happening in your area, who the right people to talk to, as well as how to find some of the lists. I would strongly recommend everybody get on the lists from any of the regulatory agencies that work on topics that you're focused on. So the Air Resources Board, Energy Commission, Cal STA, Cal Trans, all of them, they have committees within their organizations that deal with essentially what you are doing your research on. And those committees will send out email updates, including that, when they're having informational workshops or pre-rulemaking workshops. And yeah, a lot of them aren't going to be terribly relevant to you, but that is how you find out when these windows of opportunity are actually open. And this is how you find out when the agencies are really receptive to what you have to offer. So definitely go through the websites of the agencies. For legislative advocacy, what I recommend is find the committees that are going to hear the bills that are in your area of expertise. And you just have to kind of come back, and those committees will publish their agendas every so often for future hearings. Look and see the future hearings. They'll say what bills are scheduled to come up, and you can look through those bills and decide, are any of those bills interesting to my area of research, right? If it's something where you feel like you have expertise to share, then that's where you reach out to the author's office, talk to the staffer who's running it, find out what's happening, look for supporters and opponents, etc. I saw a comment saying TRB is a good resource. It's absolutely true. TRB, as well as the TRB replacements, are coming up, or professional associations. So like a lot of the engineering associations, or some of the analytical professional associations. They will also have kind of legislative or policy groups. There's also a National Science Policy Network run by a former CCST fellow that kind of works again on scientists trying to engage with policy. They have a lot of resources and training opportunities. So there are opportunities out there to help you improve your ability to engage with the policymaking space. And to the extent that many of you, I think, like me, wanted to use science as a tool to make positive change, you often have to go through policy, and so there are ways to significantly improve your capacity to do it and to achieve the outcomes you're looking for. So I think, unless there are any last questions, that's it. Thank you for your time and attention. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I will probably I'm basically going to be stuck at home on my back mostly through the end of the month, but hopefully in February I'll start being around the office again and might see some of you in person.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you all.
Thank you.